The 1963 Buick Riviera is pretty unquestionably one of the best looking designs of the early to mid 1960s. And the Riviera really charted a new class of automobile at the time, one that was designed not just to be sporty, but also luxurious. Prior to this point, there really were luxury cars and there were sporty cars, but there wasn't something that handled relatively well, had good performance, but could also deliver this performance in a silky smooth manner that was befitting of a luxury car. Thus, the Riviera was born in 1963, and it did have a number of similarities to the Buick Electra, one of which was its X-frame that was very, very similar, as seen here, to the Electra, although the wheelbase, as opposed to being 126 inches, was 117 inches. Though the wheelbase had shrunk by 9 inches overall, the width in the front and the rear, in terms of the overall tread, was only 2 inches smaller than the full-size Electra. You can also see under here that both the Electra and the Riviera for the 1963 model year had GM's X-frame that was used on a number of vehicles at the time. You can imagine that the side crash was not very good on these vehicles, but the frame worked rather well, and they were full-framed vehicles. One of the benefits that the Riviera had over the Electra was that it weighed a bit less, in part due to its overall length being 208 inches compared to the Electra's 222 inches. The Riviera weighed 4,140 pounds compared to the Electra's 4,425 pounds, which endowed it with a bit better acceleration given the reduced weight, and also that Buick employed the same engines under hood in the Riviera as they did in the Electra. In fact, the standard engine in the Riviera was Buick's 401 cubic inch nailhead V8, making 325 horsepower, but Buick during this time denoted the torque ratings on the air cleaners of their vehicles. That was 445 pound-feet of torque at 2,800 RPM. The optional engine in the Riviera, which endowed it with a bit better acceleration, was the 425 cubic inch nailhead V8, made 340 horsepower and 465 pound-feet of torque. This enabled the Riviera to reach 0 to 60 in about 8.5 seconds with the standard engine, and a little bit better with the optional engine. This compared to sports cars that took about 7 seconds 0 to 60 at the time, and luxury cars which took about 11 seconds to go from 0 to 60. So the Riviera was definitely on the sportier side of things when it came to overall acceleration, and yet, as I mentioned previously, it did execute its speed with an amazing level of overall smoothness. Now let's talk about some strange features of the Riviera that you may not know about. The first is that the Riviera was really never intended to be a Buick at all. It was instead intended to be a LaSalle. But Cadillac division didn't want the vehicle, and thus General Motors Design shopped it around to a number of other divisions, with Buick finally selecting the car to make its Riviera. The car's design was meant to be a cross between a Rolls-Royce as well as a Ferrari, at least in terms of how General Motors styling VP Bill Mitchell used to put it. And it was penned by a designer named Ned Nichols. The Riviera was first introduced as a concept car in 1963 called the Silver Arrow, which was an overall dramatic rendition of the vehicle with hidden headlights and a bit lower roofline than what made it through to production. But you can see here that the similarity between the Silver Arrow and the final production car really was quite high. When it comes to some areas of difference between the Electra and the Riviera, one element that is different between them is the prop shaft or the drive shaft. Both use two-piece, three-joint propeller shafts, but you can see here that the Riviera's prop shaft has a different center joint than the Electra's and also has a different angle to it. Another unique element of the Riviera compared to other vehicles of the time was its flush-mounted glass in the front and the rear of the vehicle. This was not typical during the time, and often if you looked at windshields or the backlights on vehicles, you'd see that they were inset pretty far, and they had large moldings around them. But one of the things that Buick Motor Division wanted to have on this vehicle was flush glass at the front and the rear. And in order to do this, Buick engineers had to design a new method of glass retention where the glass was held in place by a mastic that would set up to a near hard condition. While it seems strange to brag about flush glass today because most every car has it, It was novel for the time period, and it made the Riviera look very trim and svelte compared to other vehicles that were on the road. Another interesting element of the Riviera's construction had to do with the frameless door glass that designers wanted for the vehicle. Remember, this was a time in which many vehicles had door frames that the glass rode up and down, and this was really before the era of having a lot of frameless door glass, particularly on the upper edge of the glass. Fisher body engineers from General Motors at the time really wanted to enable this great look. But in order to do so, they devised an interesting approach that I don't believe has been employed on a car before or since. In particular, Fisher body engineers believed that in order for this design to be successfully implemented, they had to position the glass accurately against the door seals with sufficient seal pressure in order to prevent water leaks and eliminate wind noise. In order to achieve this objective, Fisher body took an entirely new approach to assembly on the doors of the Riviera and designed a door assembly with a detachable, bolted-on outer panel. Yes, I said that right. The outer panel for the door was actually detachable and was secured after all of the window adjustments had been made. This would allow the doors to be hung, the glass adjusted tight against all the seals, and then the locks and strikers could be adjusted before the door's outer skin was put in place. This is a novel approach that certainly worked and helped operators on the line locate the door glass appropriately, and the outer skin was then just simply that. It was a skin. It really wasn't a structural element. It hung over top of the internal black metal for the window. Of course, the fact that the door outer skin was hung over top of the door once all the adjustments were made meant that it was somewhat difficult to locate the front fenders in relation to the doors appropriately, given that the operators weren't going to move the door once all the glass had been properly fitted. Thus, some new methods had to be devised in order to locate the front fenders appropriately and make sure that various gaps were aligned and were pleasing to the customer's eye. Fisher body thus developed a number of fixtures and gauges and built them to help control the overall assembly of the doors and the sheet metal so that they would match appropriately. Turning to the interior of the 63 Riviera, Buick division employed a number of interesting approaches here as well. The first was that all of the instruments in the dash were designed to be removed from the front of the instrument panel as opposed to having to take everything apart. This made for easy serviceability on the vehicle and in a very handsome interior. It's an amazing looking interior in these Rivieras with the center console and the four-place seating. And Buick engineers really wanted to enable the design to come to life, but also be very, very serviceable. Another novel approach was employed when it came to air-conditioned vehicles. There was simply not enough room under hood to fit the typical evaporator in the area that's typically on the passenger compartment near the firewall. And so Buick had to employ the fact that the dash was rather large on the inside and fit the evaporator core on the interior of the vehicle. It did have to be somewhat downsized from the typical evaporator, but Buick division found that they could achieve their performance criteria even with this approach of having the evaporator on the inside and being a bit smaller than normal. And for any of you that have driven one of these vehicles that's charged on R12, you'll know that the air conditioning systems, it's pretty humorous to say that the engineers knew that these didn't perform quite as well in the Riviera as in other Buicks. You would never know it, certainly by today's standards. The air conditioning on these cars is amazingly cold. Maybe the Electra is a bit colder, but I've never found an issue in driving one of these Rivieras around with respect to the air conditioning. And lastly, the Riviera employed a new type of wiring harness called a flat wiring harness for greater reliability. These wiring harnesses had less connectors and also were designed to fit in a groove in the underbody, protecting it from damage during assembly operations. And the manufacturing of the harness was readily adaptable to numerically controlled machining operations that enabled a more consistent product to be produced. Hope you enjoyed this feature on the 1963 Riviera and some of its unique features that you probably didn't know about. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.